I was thinking about the sermon today. I was thinking about how in life, what we've done is we've created these kind of warning signals, these kind of alarms, these kind of things to grab our attention when something goes wrong, so that something worse doesn't happen. So there's not. It's kind of like just an emergency alert system. We have these kind of things that we've built into our lives to get our attention, so we'll take notice and fix something and deal with it before something worse happens. I was thinking about like the check engine light in your car. When that check engine light comes on, that means pay attention. You got something going on. You need to have this looked at. And for y'all that don't know, if that check engine light blinks, you're out of time. That's when you really have to get it checked out quick. So we have things like that we put into our life. We have check engine lights. We have smoke alarms, in our house in case something goes wrong there. You go to a doctor's office. If he wants to know about something potentially going wrong, he might draw blood. He might go through these scans and these other tests. He wants to find out beforehand if something's going wrong that he needs to know about. And you need to be treated for it. We have these kind of things. We have tornado warnings. We have tornado sirens even. If you've ever been in the Elberton area, when that one goes off, pretty much you can hear it all over town. You got these kind of things. Something is wrong. Like somebody who's cheering for Georgia Tech. It's a warning sign. We know something's going wrong. I'm joking. Anyways, so we have these things in our life, right? We even have, I don't know if you've noticed, we even have flags at the beach. Anybody ever seen the flags at the beach that are supposed to be like warning signals? To tell you when you shouldn't go in the water and other things are going on and something to be aware of. Everybody know what I'm talking about? Those flags at the beach? Okay. How many want to go to the beach and see the flags? Yes, that's a good trick, right? Let's do that. But we do that. We do that because we know, look, it's better to know beforehand and deal with it before it gets out of hand. Right? It's better to have a warning system. It's better to be alert. It's better to know that something could be going awry so we can deal with it. And we do that all throughout our life because we know we don't want to face the consequences. Well, that's in our physical, everyday kind of life, our world. There's also something spiritually like that going on too. There's also something spiritually like that going on too it's kind of an indicator, it's kind of like that check engine light, that something's going wrong in our soul. Something's going on wrong in our head and our heart, and it's just not right. And you need to pay attention to it. You need to take notice of it. Because something is going awry, spiritually. And if you don't deal with it, things start to break down. You start having those marriage issues you never had before, maybe. You start having those work issues you never had before, maybe. You're starting to fall into these temptations that used to really not bother you so much. Your world starts to look different because spiritually, you're off track. You're breaking away. You're getting away from God in your heart and in your mind. And so what we're going to talk about today, what our focus is the warning signal. The warning signal. This is what I want to point you to is a warning signal that we can see in Scripture when things are starting to go wrong with you. And you can just kind of look in the mirror and ask yourself this question, and you can see, okay, am I getting off track? Something going on in my head and my heart, and maybe it hasn't shown itself yet. Maybe the relationship problems I mentioned, and maybe other things, temptations, maybe they haven't materialized yet. Just like that tornado hasn't hit yet. But circumstances are right, and the weather conditions are right to create one. And so that's the kind of thing we want to talk about today. The warning signal, the spiritual warning signal. So say that with me. The warning signal. One more time. The warning signal. want to focus on today. I thought about this with the warning signal because I thought about a friend of mine from years ago who ignored the warning signal in his car. He was a young salesman, made a lot of money. He was like top in sales. And he was a young guy, bachelor, and he bought himself this brand new Lexus sports car. I don't know how much that thing cost, but everybody just kind of drooled over it when he drove it into the park. I was like, wow, that's the nicest car I've ever seen. And it had warning signals going off in it. He didn't pay any attention to it because he was great at sales, knew nothing about cars. And he had that thing in downtown Atlanta one day lock up on him. And he could never drive it again. And he took it to the dealer. And he's all upset. He's thinking something's wrong with his car. You know, he's paid so much money for this thing. You know, it's only like 3 years old at this point. You know, what's going on? He never changed the oil for like 3 years. And that light went on for the oil. And he ignored it. He ignored the warning signal. And the light went on for the check engine. And he ignored the warning signal. And he ruined a very luxurious, expensive sports car. Because he didn't pay attention to the warning signals. And we got one spiritually that we need to pay attention to. So if you have your Bibles, or you can get one on your phone or tablet or however, go to the New Testament this morning. And we're going to look at the largest letter that the Apostle Paul wrote. The longest one he wrote. Anybody know which one it is? What's the longest one, the biggest one he wrote? Anybody know? Romans. Book of Romans. You know it's the longest because it's the first. They're in descending order. So they get smaller as you go. And so Romans, the Apostle Paul, is what we're going to look at this morning. The book of Romans. Now the book of Romans is, like I said, it's from Paul. He's writing this letter to the church at Rome. And this is kind of unique because he's never been there. Usually, you know, he's writing to churches that he's very familiar with. He knows the people. They know him. A lot of times it's the churches that he started, you know, where he was the one that first brought the gospel. He was like the first missionary to that city. Well, in Rome, they have long had a church. And it wasn't because one of the apostles or somebody like that came and started it. None of the apostles had ever been to Rome. And so it's kind of a unique situation. He doesn't know them personally. But his goal is to visit them soon. And so what he's doing is he's laying the groundwork. You know, he's sending them this letter, and he's introducing himself in this big way. And he writes this very long letter, and he knows it's a mixed congregation. There's some Jews, there's some Gentiles. You know, it's not all the same. So he writes this long letter. And Paul's very strategic. He's a very strategic-minded person. And what he's done is he has a group of people that are already there. Like a first-hand team that have gone in and started to work with the Christians in Rome. And if you look at the last chapter of Romans, and you see these long lists of names, and Paul's saying, say hello to this person, and say hello to this person, and say hello to this person. It's that big group of team of people that he knows that have already gone ahead to Rome. So he's thinking very strategically. And so he writes this letter to the church at Rome. And in it, like I said, it's very long, and it goes through the whole history of Israel. And it's a sad history, because there's a long legacy of sin that God has to deal with in Israel. But it even goes back before there was Abraham and Israel. It even goes back before that. And so Paul writes this letter, and he's telling this long, sad, awful story of sin in the human race and how God's trying to bring salvation to people. And so he goes to it, and we're in chapter 1, so you don't have to go far. In chapter 1, he starts going down this long road throughout the book. And he talks about how God has revealed himself to people, and they rejected him. God has revealed himself to people, and they rejected him. He said, God's attributes, God's character, the essential nature of God, these things people knew early on, and they rejected God. So they knew, and they rejected God, and they're without excuse. He made himself known to them. And got chapter 1, we'll be at verse 21. So Romans chapter 1, verse 21. And Paul writes, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened." So he says, they didn't glorify God. They didn't give God the honor and the respect that he deserves. They didn't worship him no longer. Nor were they thankful. And he says, their hearts became darkened, and their thinking is futile. And if you go through the rest of the chapter, what you'll find is Paul really developing this, and he's saying, look, he says this leads to idolatry. This is in verse 23. He says this leads to idolatry after that. If you ever wonder where that idea came from, about worshiping, these pantheon of gods, and there's a god for the forest, and there's a god for springtime, and there's a god for wine, and there's a god for, the family. If you ever wonder where that came from, it came from this. As people rejected the true God, they didn't believe in nothing. They believed in anything. So when people reject the true God, it's not that they believed in nothing. They believed in anything. They believe, in all these different gods, that there's a God for everything, and sometimes it even talks about them worshiping animals. And the golden calf, that's a perfect example. People worshipped anything. And so he goes on this road, and then he talks about the immorality that grew out of that, and then he talks about how there was more evil, and then he just talks about, this long list of sin that just became entrenched in humanity. It's just an awful picture. You don't need to look at the paper or look at the internet or anything like that to know that it's true. Because we're living it out. It's still here. And so Paul goes through this long list. But look how it starts. People turn away from God and worship. And it says, nor were they thankful. Nor were they thankful. Before it became idolatry, before they started building temples and these statues that they worshipped and all this other kind of stuff, before that, before it became all this immorality, before it became all this evil and wickedness, how did it all start? What was the indicator that things were going awry, that things were going downhill? Early on, it can be seen. Before there was anything physical going on. This happens in your heart and in your mind. You're not thankful. Before their lives blew up and there was violence and abuse and racism and all this other kind of craziness and evil, before there was any of it, nor were they thankful. Nor were they thankful. See, what happens is our hearts turn away from God. And we reject the gift and the giver. We reject God as the one who's giving the gift. And we no longer value the gift because it's just something that we've done. It becomes something that we've produced. It's something we're responsible for. It becomes something that we created. It's something that's on our own. We don't need God because we took care of it. And look how these things are related. Because when you no longer value the blessing, when you no longer value God's blessing, you no longer value God. You see how that connection is? When you no longer value God's blessing, you no longer value God. You're not thankful. It's all about you. You're not grateful. Every blessing that you're counting is just from you. It's your own pride. Your home? Well, I worked hard and I saved and I bought it. Your health? Well, I kind of took care of myself, My finances? Well, I kept my job. I worked hard. Played by the rules. My abilities? Well, I've just kind of worked with these talents and I've been good with this, and so, that's just how it's developed. All these things, all these blessings that we have, you can reject them and reject God at the same time. Because you see them as just something that would naturally come to you because of who you are and what you've done. It's a prideful thing. You're rejecting God's hand. You're rejecting that He gave it to you. And so we do that to our own demise. Because once we stop seeing Him as the giver of these things, that's the warning sign. We're going downhill. In our hearts and our minds, we've turned away from God. It's no longer His blessings. It's look what I've done. Look what I worked for. Look what I accomplished. It's no longer His blessings. When we reject the blessings of God, we reject Him. And so being thankful is that warning sign. To look in the mirror and ask yourself, is something going wrong in my heart and in my head and the way I'm seeing things and the way I'm thinking about things? Is something going wrong here? Because I'm not really looking at the things in my life, the good things in my life. I'm no longer looking at them as blessings. In fact, I'm overlooking them. As the very first song we sang, which I didn't even know we were going to sing it this morning. It just was chosen beforehand. Count your blessings one by one, right? When you're no longer thankful, there's something going wrong in your heart and in your head. And that's the warning sign you need to look at. Because when you don't address it, you're turning away from God. And you're giving yourself, and this is just how it happens. I mean, if you see how Paul writes the letter and how it just is this big decline of human morality, when you don't address it, you give yourself permission to do all this other stuff. Because you're cutting yourself off from God. He's no longer the one who blesses you. He's no longer the one in control. He's no longer the one you need to listen to. He's no longer the one who's taking care of you. You're on your own. Do as you please. The gift came from your own hand, and the giver is not even in the picture. So that's what I want to put on your heart and mind this morning. This warning sign, before this long, sad story that Paul writes about how sin has taken over the human race and corrupted it and broken it down and created all this havoc, it all began from people turning away from God, and they weren't thankful. They had no gratitude in their heart.